In this video, I'm going to show you how to do basic duplicate stitch. You'll have to get your materials together, obviously whatever you're going to be stitching on, a tapestry needle that's appropriate in size to the yarn you're going to be using for the duplicate stitching, your chart, if there is one, and of course the yarn needed to do the stitching. Now, to prepare your yarn, you'll want to break off small pieces of it. You can see in this chart there's really not many stitches, so you won't need long lengths of yarn. If you're duplicate stitching larger areas, you can either use a longer piece of yarn or use several pieces of yarn and attach them together at the back of the work. So let's get started. So I've broken off a small piece of my yarn that I'm going to use to do the stitching. I just have to thread my needle. Now usually in a pattern that requires duplicate stitching, it'll show you in a chart where to put the actual stitches. In this case, since this is just a swatch, I'm just going to pick a random spot. To start, you usually want to start at one end of your chart and move to the other end. You can start at the top and move down, you can start at one side and move to the other. It really doesn't matter, but it should be done in some sort of an order. So in this case, I'm going to start here, move on to this row, move back onto this row, and keep working in that fashion across the rows to have as few floats in the open spaces here as possible. And that'll make it so that you don't catch your fingers on it, because if you're kind of going in this odd direction, things like that, it won't look quite as even. You certainly can do that, and especially with smaller, more spread out designs, you can kind of skip around a little bit. But if you do keep it more even and go row by row, you'll have a lot fewer issues in the back of your work. So to start, you pass your needle through the base of one stitch where the two points of the V come together. Now you'll want to pull all of the yarn or thread through the work and just leave a very small tail at the back. And that's why you want to cut smaller pieces, because you'll have to keep pulling this through every single time, and if you have several yards it's going to be a little bit tedious. So to do the actual stitch, you just follow where the yarn itself goes in the stitch. In this case, you go behind the stitch above, and then back down through the same hole where I put the needle in originally. Now with duplicate stitch, since you're not necessarily beholden to stitch-wise and row-wise, from here, this is where you decide where your next stitch will be before you pull this yarn through. So in this case, I'm going to be moving to this stitch here on the chart, which corresponds to this stitch here on the knitting. So I will push this needle through the bottom of that stitch and make one fluid motion to end the first stitch and begin the second. Now because I'm going to be working in this direction across this row, I'll be going through the stitch above in the opposite direction. That just keeps the yarn a little bit cleaner. Now when you're pulling your stitches through, you want to leave them a little bit looser than the gauge of the fabric, especially if it's something that's going to be worn, because you do want to make sure that the stitches are going to match the stretch of the fabric that you're working with. Now we're ready to move on to the next stitch. So in this case, because it's the stitch next door, I now move over and through the bottom of the next stitch. You basically continue in that motion, stitching in the direction in which you're working. Go through the stitch above and out through the bottom of the next stitch. Now on the next one I'm going to be moving up. So when you go up a row, you basically push the needle through the bottom of the stitch you're working on and then right up through the top of that same stitch. So I'm going to be going in here and then moving up. So basically you're stitching through the purl bump of that stitch on the back. And now I'm going to be moving in this direction. So from here over to here. So I'm going to be stitching through the stitch above in that direction. Otherwise, the motion is exactly the same. Now on this next row, I'm going to be moving over to start one of the other petals of the flower. So we go back to the chart and see that this petal starts 2 stitches over and 1 stitch above. So you just have to look at your knitting and count over. If there's going to be a couple stitches here, this is where I'm going to start. So it's 1 stitch above, 2 stitches over. So we go down through the bottom of this stitch and then up through the bottom of the next stitch that I'll be working on. And again, in this case, I'm going to be moving in this direction, so I'll be stitching in that direction. Now if you're familiar with grafting, this is exactly the same thing. It's just, in this case, you actually have a substrate on which to do the grafting. And then we skip one, move to the next stitch, which finishes the first petal. We go behind the stitch above, and then back down through the same hole where I put the needle in originally. And then we skip one again and move on to petal number 3. And in this way, you simply continue doing the same motion, back and forth, up and down, whichever direction you want to actually do your stitching. Just make sure you keep it consistent while you're working. And before you know it, you'll have a very interesting design on your work. Well, here's the finished duplicate stitch motif, and as you can see, it's stretchy just like the original knit fabric, and it fits just within the chart here. The back is very clean. There's just a few places where you see little floats, and otherwise it blends right in with the fabric. Now to weave in the ends, you would just weave them in as you normally do, making sure that they stay within the bounds of that duplicate stitched area. That's just so that you don't see little bits of yarn coming through the solid color beneath. So that's basically all you need to know about duplicate stitch. You can make big designs, small designs, multicolor designs, but really it's all the same stitch. Out through the bottom, around the stitch above, back down through the bottom, and onto your next stitch.